Please be seated. Okay, so the winter solstice is going to happen while we are gathered here together. We will be in the northern hemisphere, the tilt that is the farthest point away from the sun. I can't remember, I think it's like 10:03 or something like that. It's right when we're together. The farthest away from the sun, the shortest day, and the longest night. You know, starting when I was a teenager and stretching into my young adulthood, I played at the same church every single Christmas Eve. It was just outside of Philadelphia, which is where I grew up. It's on what's called the Main Line in Philadelphia, and it was an Episcopal church. I have a very clear memory of driving to this church. I have an even clearer memory of driving home because I always got lost, because this was, of course, before Google Maps and GPS and things like that. And always, 100%, every single time I had to stop at the same gas station and ask for the same directions to get home. But on my way to church, I also have a very clear memory of something that happened every year, which was that I would get there a little bit early, because I always left way ahead of time. And I would, before I got to the church parking lot, just pull off onto a quiet, dark side street and just take a minute in the dark and the quiet to catch my breath. Because Christmas Eve, of course, is a very, very big night for professional musicians. And in fact, in my own family, we were often split between 2 or 3 different churches, heading out at different times to do rehearsals before the service, et cetera, et cetera. It was always busy. And so I would just take those couple minutes to sit there, enjoy the quiet, enjoy the dark, and just have a minute alone. And to me, that always felt like the most sacred moment on Christmas Eve. In our gospel reading today, we meet Joseph, as the writer of the Gospel of Matthew presents him, in a moment of darkness, but not a moment of quiet. He is finding out that the woman he is engaged to be married to is pregnant, and he knows that he is not the father of this child. This is definitely a moment of darkness for him in his life. Now, there is a lot that we don't know about Mary and Joseph. In fact, I would say mountains more that we don't know than what we know. So much is conjecture. We don't know if this was a marriage or an engagement of love or not, but the chances that it was a marriage of love were actually quite slim. It just wasn't how marriage was done in these times. It wasn't the big romantic love thing that we do today. It was more about practicality and the joining together of families, and of course, the giving and receiving of property, which is what Mary would be to Joseph once they were married. She would belong to her husband like a piece of property. But that doesn't mean that Joseph didn't want to love Mary. That possibility was always open for people. And in fact, we see in this story about him that he probably was the type of man not to revel in the power he had over his wife, or to simply see her as property and not as a human being. So what do we know about Joseph? Well, for one, that he saw his wife to be as a human being first. Even in a system that did not require that, and maybe did not even encourage it. When we read that Joseph was a quote-unquote righteous man, I have to think that this is part of what it means. It also meant, of course, that Joseph was a law-abiding person. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, the word righteous is a really big deal. It happens more in this gospel than in any other gospel, something like 24 times. And the word righteous is connected to this idea of someone who obeys Jewish law. So Matthew was written for an audience that was very concerned about the connection between Jewish law and Jesus. And so to say that Joseph was a righteous man was to say that he was a law-abiding man. He took the Jewish law, the Torah, very, very seriously. And in those times, there were two choices for what someone could do when a woman was caught with another man when she was engaged to be married to someone else. The two choices were she could be publicly shamed and stoned to death, or her fiancé could write up a document of divorce and present it to her and her father. Joseph, being a righteous man, chose the latter, to dismiss her quietly, to divorce her in a way that would not put her life at stake and would not subject her to public shaming. You know, it's amazing to think about how messy the story of Jesus' birth is, isn't it? In this way, I think the story of Jesus stands apart from virtually every other world religion that I know of. It's true that right before this passage in Matthew, we see a listing of all of Jesus' ancestors. And we see that he was born from the line of David, that they trace it all the way back to Abraham in this genealogy. And that is maybe the cleanest thing about Jesus' birth, that he comes from the line of David. However, on closer inspection, the line of David itself is not all that clean. David, of course, was a deeply troubled man who hurt many people and made extremely questionable decisions. In fact, Bathsheba, one of the many women that David injured, she is listed in the ancestry. She's listed as Uriah's wife, not by name, but she is listed. And there are actually 3 other women who are listed in the ancestry, which was completely countercultural. Ancestries were only men at that time. But within Jesus' ancestry, not only is there Bathsheba, but there is also Tamar and there is Rahab. Rahab was a sex worker, a prostitute, who nevertheless hid 2 Israeli spies, lied to a king about it, and then helped them escape. So yes, Jesus has a royal ancestry, but it is, at the very least, a very colorful ancestry. And then, of course, before Jesus is even born, his parents are considering divorce. It only gets messier from here, of course. He's born as his parents are traveling, and there's no room at the inn for them to stay. Herod is already trying to kill this baby as soon as he's born, and they become refugees in Egypt. It's as though the writers are going out of their way to make a point that God chooses the messy, broken, and darkest places in our lives to be born. And there are, of course, other stories in other beautiful world religions where the founders are birthed in a clean way, a miraculous way, without any of the mess. But that's not the story of Jesus. I do think it's something that sets him apart in terms of religious figures. So let's go back to the darkness where Joseph is. In the middle of the mess, he is disappointed, at least, with the news. He is at least disappointed. At most, he is devastated, depending on how he felt about Mary. But he doesn't allow either one of those feelings to become the basis for violence. He doesn't allow his own shame to become a weapon against someone with less power than he has. He doesn't even yell. He doesn't become self-righteous. He remains righteous. And it is in that place of darkness in his life where indeed he is visited by angels in a dream who give him more information about this situation. That the pregnancy is divine and that Joseph should not be afraid to move forward with his engagement to Mary. And thus, Joseph, quiet, law-abiding Joseph, who didn't want to make a scene, finds himself in the center of what will become a very, very chaotic and very holy story. I have to wonder if Joseph's humility is what enabled him to hear the voice of the angel in his dream. I imagine it would be much harder to hear the voice of an angel if you were consumed with self-righteousness and wanting to make sure that you were avenged and that the party who injured you got what was coming to them. I also wonder if his commitment to Mary's dignity, really, is what enabled him to obey. Because it's one thing to have a dream, it's another thing to do what you're told in the dream. And what about this fear? Did you notice that? The angel says, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife. What might he have been afraid of? And how might he have walked through that fear? Some of the ancient church fathers, think Augustine and Origen, have suggested that Joseph's fear might have been, when he heard this news that the pregnancy was from God, a fear that he would not be up to the task of being a father to this child. What could quiet, law-abiding Joseph have to offer the child of God? The angel makes it clear, you are to take Mary as your wife. This would be to protect Mary and the child, and to name the child Jesus. Implied here is that the child will be adopted into Joseph's lineage. In other words, he will also be the son of Joseph. Quiet, law-abiding, unassuming Joseph. A carpenter by trade, not a powerful man, not highly educated, not well-read, not wealthy, but he was righteous. He saw others as human beings, even those he was not required to see as human beings, even those that some laws seem to suggest were less than human. So Joseph doesn't have a flashy made-for-TV movie story like so many in the lineage of Jesus do. He doesn't rescue spies. He doesn't build massive temples like Solomon. He doesn't make great decisions, and he doesn't make terrible decisions. He's quiet and steady and likely invisible to many others. But his willingness to use what he had, his mercy and his protection and his lineage, even though it wasn't flashy, to use all of that to bring God into the world is what makes him indispensable to the story of salvation. God does not arrive only through dramatic rescues or bold pronouncements, but through the steady faithfulness of someone who chooses care over control and presence over pride. Joseph shows us that holiness often looks like showing up, staying when it would be easier to walk away, and offering shelter when the world is not safe. In his quiet obedience, God finds room to dwell. And the world is changed not by spectacle, but by love practiced in ordinary human ways. Thanks be to God.